What is the best process for coming up with long-term stories for yourself in pro wrestling? Welcome back to BEATER Wrestling. This question was actually asked from one of my YouTube subscribers on how to come up with ideas for yourself. You're having writer's block, you're struggling with creativity, maybe you don't quite understand who your character is, which makes it a lot more difficult. I definitely have a process that I've followed that has helped me out, and some tips that might help you or at least give you more confidence in that aspect. Firstly, I'll say that most of my ideas always started as something really small and then snowballed into something greater. So don't feel like you have to map out every little thing. One of the biggest problems with doing that anyway is that it often won't happen the way you mapped it out. So you can put together 15 shows of storyline and I guarantee you it's just not going to happen in that way. If you look back at some of my previous episodes, we spoke about all the things that can get in the way, particularly at the independent level. So I like to start with the end point. Think about where you want to end up as a character, where you think your character could evolve, how it could change over time, and then go back and kind of reverse engineer to figure out those little key turning points that you need. And at the end of it, you might have a year-long story and you've really only got like 4 different key points. You've got the start, you've got 2 middle bits, some obstacles that might be presented, and then you got the end point. And that's a really good place to start because then you can fill in the gaps as you go, depending on what sort of moving parts and pieces you have at your disposal. Now, if you're struggling with that whole character side and how your character should evolve and things like that, start by thinking about human emotion. And if you're a heel or a babyface or you plan on switching to one or the other, think about some real natural human emotions that villains and heroes often feel. Look at things like Marvel movies and dramas and look at their character arcs. How do they change over time? How does Spider-Man change from one movie to the next? What kind of obstacles are being put in front of him that he must overcome, and how does that change him in the long term? So think about some of those emotions your character might feel. Jealousy, frustration, anger, aggression, resilience, and what types of things would make them feel that way. As a heel, maybe seeing one of their old training partners progress ahead of them brings out feelings of jealousy, and then that becomes a thing. I find that also helps you decide who you want to work with and what sorts of characters would bounce well off you and those emotions. You can also think about your endpoint of who you would like to put over in the process, particularly if you're a more experienced wrestler. What could also help is if you go back and look at my old YouTube video on your kryptonite in pro wrestling, which was all about discovering what your character's weakness is and how important it is to have a weakness to play off. Because whether you're a heel or a babyface, having some sort of weakness provides great drama for your story. So at this point, you've thought about your character, what sorts of emotions they could show, what sorts of strengths and weaknesses they have, where you want your character to end up, and that could even be, putting someone else over on the roster. And maybe you've thought about other characters on the roster who would play well off you. Which character dynamics work well with each other. So now we're a little bit closer to the end goal. We can think about the characters we have involved, what their motivations would be as pro wrestlers, and how those motivations might align or intersect. Because often a lot of great drama and great conflict comes from those things. Maybe 2 wrestlers vying for the exact same goal of becoming the heavyweight champion. Or maybe 2 wrestlers with very different worldviews and opinions. One villain doesn't care who he steps on to make his way, and the babyface feels heavily against that and wants to do everything by the book and everything the right way. And if we're looking at long-term storytelling, this is the point where we start thinking about what sorts of twists and turns we want to have. Because great long-term storytelling isn't just linear. There's peaks and there's valleys. It's not just about making everything a shock and a surprise, but every now and then when the crowd thinks you're going to zig, you might zag, which is a good way to extend things out and get a greater payoff in the long run. So that right there is how I commonly think about long-term storytelling and how to put it all together. But it's by no means any particular order or priority. Sometimes I'll see someone on the roster who has a character I think would bounce well off my character, or who I would just really like to work with creatively. And then that will kind of be the start of it. And then I'll think, how would our characters interact? And then that starts to create other things. So I don't always work from the end goal backwards and look at how my character's going to evolve backwards. And I don't always look at the long term. Sometimes it's just, I want to do something for 1 or 2 shows. And if it goes well, maybe we can extend it. Maybe it can grow into something completely different. But a lot of this is idealistic thinking. And I want to talk about some things that could cut your legs off and waste your time if you haven't thought about these first. The first one is the promotion's needs. If you're wrestling for a promotion where the crowds and venues are always different, shows are sporadic, there's not a lot of long-term storytelling, maybe no social media presence, maybe you're not even getting booked every show, then how likely is it actually going to be that your storyline's going to happen? And if it does happen, that anyone is going to understand it if you're thinking in that long term. Most promotions have a flavor to what they're doing. So, if they're putting family-friendly, kid-focused shows out there and you want to do this big 18-plus storyline that's brutal and full of gore and sketchy subjects, then again, good luck ever getting it over the line. I'll also say that you do need some awareness of where you are in the pecking order. If you're a brand new rookie who's 3 matches in and you've just been in squash matches where you're getting beaten show to show, then pitching a 1-year storyline probably just isn't going to happen. Maybe aim a little bit lower. Aim to pitch something over 1 show, over 2 shows, over 3 shows at the very most. And maybe if you can build some equity and impress the promoter, maybe then they'll give you the reins on something that's 6 months or 12 months or longer. But you have to prove yourself first. And finally, be flexible. Your timeline may not and probably will not match the timeline of the promotion. So don't get upset if things don't happen your way. Make sure that if you need to speed things up for a show or 2 or extend them out for a show or 2, that you accept the mission, you're positive about it, and you do everything you can to still get the important points across. As I always say, storylines that are more about you and your character development are always a lot easier to get over the line because it doesn't matter so much who you're in the ring with. You don't need these 3 or 4 people to be your opponent, because if they're not available, that can really throw things into disarray. So think more about yourself, who you are, who you want to be. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of World Beater Wrestling. If this is ever a question that you struggled with, maybe it gives you a bit more clarity. Coming up with things like promos and storyline ideas, just these little hypothetical things are great ways to just get your creative mind firing, whether they happen or not. It's fantastic practice. We want to be well-rounded pro wrestlers. And speaking of well-rounded pro wrestlers, my worldbeaterwrestling.com Patreon is all about that. It's a place of exclusive content, networking, and collaboration with professional wrestlers from around the globe. We've got a great thing going, and videos like this do appear a week early and ad-free amongst a whole lot of other content. So check it out over at worldbeaterwrestling.com. If you're here on YouTube, I would love a like, a subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And I'll see you next week for another episode of World Beater Wrestling.